This past Friday was a holiday that may have been new to many of us. June 19th, known as Juneteenth, commemorates the freeing of the final remaining enslaved Africans in Texas. On the 19th of June, 1865, General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, to announce the freedom of enslaved people. This news came delivered as General Order Number 3, which began with these words: "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer. This is 1865. The news is very late in getting to Texas, and there are any number of reasons why. From a story of an earlier messenger that was murdered while en route to a theory that it was to wait until one last cotton crop was brought in without paying any wages. Whatever the story, it isn't a good one. Justice delayed is justice denied. Over the intervening years, celebrations of Juneteenth have ebbed in the early 20th century due to harsh economic realities, world wars, half-hearted attempts at assimilation, and of course the whitewashing of history, whose textbooks have taught about kindly Abraham Lincoln and his famous proclamation, without mentioning the delay and the implementation troubles he encountered. The celebrations of Juneteenth, which is also known as Freedom Day or Emancipation Day, began being more widely observed with the rise of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and this year there were many a celebration and commemoration indeed. And yet, it's still a new old holiday, and so we all have some work to do to get it into our minds, to say nothing of into our hearts. This day of independence for the last enslaved Africans on American soil is the beginning of many days, years, and decades of continuing racial injustice. General Granger's 1865 order requires a, quote, absolute equality of rights and rights of property between people and people who thought they owned people. This, of course, didn't happen then. No Black folk got the house or the horse, or even child support payments in the divorce of American chattel slavery. There was no equality then. There is no equality now. Separated by law, enslaved people now free, the whites and the blacks were not equal. And the whites, whose pens wrote the history books, the laws, and the tax codes, were quick to make sure equality didn't cost them anything, not even a decent wage or a chance to live. The swiftness of Jim Crow laws enacted across the country, and particularly in the South in the years following 1865, tell us the story of white supremacy that demands inequity. Many years ago, I was a freshly minted undergraduate with a degree in English literature, a thesis on a medieval Latin poem written by a French cleric, and absolutely no idea how any of this would lead to a job. I spent a spring interning with an architectural history firm in Washington, D.C., doing the sort of research and writing projects that historical societies, government agencies, real estate developers, and private owners of historic properties needed written. One of the projects I staffed was a survey of historic African-American home sites in the history-rich county of Loudoun, Virginia. Using the 1860, 1870, and 1880 census maps, I learned how to drive slowly through back roads and to hike up dirt paths looking for markers of foundations or chimneys. We charted free Black communities by literally connecting little black square dots, squiggles, on old census maps, looking for what remains. Now, in many places, these homes, quickly and cheaply built, are ruins now. They're the sort of remains curious to young kids racing their bicycles through the woods. And in other places, these houses still stand, added on to, amended, and oftentimes inhabited by descendants of the original builders. We drew and photographed everything that we found. We traced foundations. We redrew long overgrown walking paths. We looked for the historic core of now sprawling houses originally built by people when they were first given their freedom. We found remnants of churches and schools. Often they were the same building. And we noted how the clusters of Black houses interacted with the larger county that is known for sweeping green fields and gently rolling hills. What we were doing was documenting buildings, but the story we were telling was of people. People who had gained their freedom and were given nothing for it. People who were told they were equal and then had the rug pulled out from under them every step they took. People who didn't look like the other residents of the county, but who built communities of hope and of resilience and of faith in defiance to all else. The story we were telling was of Black dignity and strength. Here's another story, one that I admit is a little odd for a Father's Day tale, so my apologies in advance. Abram and Sarah had been married a long time and had pitched their tents on many a mountain. Well, they didn't do the pitching themselves. They had enslaved people of their own to do the heavy lifting. Abram and Sarah grew old without having any children, but oh, how they wanted a child. And they thought that Sarah had passed through childbearing years, but she had a plan. She had an enslaved Egyptian girl, which is to say a girl with darker skin than herself, whose body she thought she owned. With all the privilege of being a so-called master, Sarah gave Hagar to Abram, so that, as scripture says, Sarah might obtain children by her, which is to say, to have a child by the rape of an innocent enslaved woman who could not object. Abram did as his wife requested, and Hagar conceived Abram's firstborn son, Ishmael, when Abram was 86 years old. As soon as it happened, as soon as Hagar conceived, Sarah's suspicion and her envy started growing at a rate twice as fast as the child in Hagar's womb. A few years later, when Abraham, renamed by virtue of a divine covenant, was 100 years old, Sarah, also renamed by divine pronouncement, bears Abraham his second male child, Isaac. As Isaac grew, scripture tells us that he played with his older brother, and this sight, these two boys, these two brothers playing together, bothered Sarah. Sarah had never really accepted Ishmael as her own, nor should she have, though her supremacy as master meant she could do whatever she wanted. And yet her fragility, her worry, was always present. One day, again gathering all of her privilege, she goes again to her husband with what feels to be a very odd request. Out of jealousy and anxiety, she tells Abraham to cast out his firstborn son, for he could possibly never be equal with Abraham's second son, her son. Happy Father's Day. Now, if this sounds distressing, it is. And it was to Abraham as well. So distressing to Abraham was this that God again steps in to comfort Abraham's concern. Sidebar here about the book of Genesis. The story of God in these early Genesis chapters is distressing again and again. This story that we get this morning, between the story of Hagar's forced pregnancy and her subsequent banishment, between these two stories is the story of Lot and his angelic visitors, as well as the story of Lot and his lusty daughters. At this point in the faith story, God is so worried about progeny that there's some questionable ethics to what's going on behind closed doors. But here in this story, God says to Abraham, don't worry. I'll build a nation of Ishmael's offspring too, a separate nation. Not quite an equal one to the one I'll build for Isaac, but pretty close. Pretty close is as close to equality as we've ever managed to believe. Why is this so hard? 21st century people of faith, we don't, I hope, believe in the owning of other people anymore. Unlike the time of Sarah and Abraham, or unlike the time of America up to just 130 years ago, we don't believe there should be slaves or masters. And yet, just like the time of Sarah, and just like this time of state-sanctioned police violence against Black and brown bodies, we see how systems of inequity breed fragility among those who have the upper hand. The closer equality gets, the more worried the former masters become. When you get what you have through systems of oppression, you are always looking over your shoulder and you feel fragile, because what if that illogical oppression quickly turns against you? We spend so much more time addressing the fears of the haves that they will not, that we fail to do the work of giving the have-nots what they should. In a letter to the ancient Romans, a people also known for their cruel treatment of enslaved people, Paul poses the question, should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means, is his answer. This same answer must be our answer whenever asked about the sins of our own day. Should we continue our economic sins that warehouse rather than provide homes for people in prisons or projects? By no means. Should we continue our budgetary sins that provide more for weapons and brutality than schools and social services? By no means. Should we continue our racist sins that look on strong, hope-filled, resilient Black bodies with fear and oppression? By no means. Juneteenth, this past Friday. LGBTQ Pride next Sunday. The 4th of July soon to follow. Friends, have you noticed? This is liberation season. These days of independence must be celebrated, honored, and heeded. Marches that lead us to freedom and equity for all people. Walks that started in small communities of people on the margins. People who banded together either in the hills of Loudoun County or nightclubs like Stonewall and Pulse, places that breed hope for people too proud to despair. This is liberation season. It comes when the days are longest, these days of solstice and summer, because we have so much work to do. Work that comes as clearly today as it was required 130 years ago, when a Union general called for the, quote, absolute equality of rights and rights of property between all people. Should we continue the sin of ignoring this demand, of denying equity, of maintaining oppression of any person? By no means. By no means. By no means.